So our discussion today is really about the purpose and vision of this framework. This is our evaluation framework for youth well-being. We're going to go into it in quite a bit more detail and talk about how it supports us and how it can support the sector. It's designed specifically to respond to the organizational, social, and political realities of grassroots youth programs. But before we get into the details of this framework, I'm excited now to turn it over to our academic leads who are here so that they can reflect back on how we got here, what we needed to ask ourselves to be able to develop this framework. So what's the backstory of how we enter this work? So I'd like to invite first Sarah to reflect on one aspect of, I want to invite our academic directors to look back on the year, and I'm going to pose some key questions to them, wondering what we were thinking about at the beginning when we were given this mandate from MCYS to develop YouthREX. What were some of the things that we had to keep in mind? So Sarah, I'm wondering if I could first ask you, what did you know that we needed to think about when we were given this mandate?
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, I think one of the first challenges that we faced were the politics in evaluation. Can you go to the next slide? I think. What I mean here is that evaluation is really political because there are things that are important to us that are at stake. It's staff, it's resources, it's the actual programs, and there are limited resources that people are struggling to get hold of. So this makes it political. It makes it really important for us. And the literature looks at a number of themes and debates that sort of are occurring in that highly politicized field. And the first challenge is one of who decides what data is needed and how it should be collected. And what we know is that that decision is rarely made by people who work on the front lines or by young people who are receiving services. What happens is those decisions get made farther removed from the organization itself. And that means that it often doesn't reflect the experiences of people who are at the grassroots doing the work. So the choices are often driven by economics about the interests of funding organizations, not actually by the community in which the programs are actually embedded. The other thing is that what counts as good or reliable evidence also reflects the organizations who decide on the questions and what needs to be explored. And so the judgment about what's of value is also not located in the community, which can present a real challenge for us. So next slide. In response to this, communities are also articulating their politics through asking questions about that system and about what they can do to change it up, to make evaluation more responsive and meaningful for them. So community groups and organizations like yourselves are asking what questions are important to them. So this isn't just what questions do my funder want or does the local politician want, but what do we want to know about our own work? What's important to us? Organizations are also asking, what do we need to evaluate? So then we have to focus sometimes on what we need because there's this tension between how to meet everybody's needs. And after we meet the funders' needs, what's left over for us to ask about what's important to our work so that we can continue to move on. How do we evaluate and what does evaluation mean has also been a question that's sort of emerged out of communities because communities are saying the methods and approaches to evaluation that are common are very difficult to mobilize in their organization. They often don't have the time or the resources, and even if they did have that, those methods don't answer the questions that they have. So this is changing an understanding of evaluation so that evaluation becomes asking what is meaningful for us, how do we know that we're doing what we want to be doing, and how do we then share that story more broadly. And the final question that communities are asking is, how can we change based on what we learn in evaluation? So usually, or traditionally, evaluation has meant that you go through the process, you collect the information, you stick it in a report and send it off to the funder, and nobody thinks about it again until you have to collect it again and resubmit. What we're thinking about at YouthREX is, are there ways to design evaluation so that it is an opportunity for an organization to build, innovate, develop, and grow in directions that are really important to them? So this diagram is really helpful. It sort of looks at both the relations of power and dynamics that shape evaluation. So we know that often young people are excluded from evaluation. We know that people living in poverty are often excluded from evaluation. So it's looking at those broad relations, those patterns of who gets included and who gets excluded and whose voices are heard and not heard. But also, this articulates the diversity of experiences, both differences of experiences and who might have shared experiences to build and value. So at YouthREX, we really try to think about how can we design evaluations that are embedded in the culture and identities and experiences of the community group, and that challenge the existing patterns of evaluation that exclude, and make sure people who are excluded are actually included.
And now I'd like to invite Uzo to reflect on some additional challenges that we identified at the beginning.
Am I unmuted? Thank you, Rebecca. In addition to the challenges around politics of evaluation that Sarah summed up really well, another challenge that we kept in mind when we approached our evaluation capacity building mandate was trying to pay attention to the concerns that frontline youth workers usually have about evaluation, whether evaluation can really be aligned with practice. And I think we put up there from the report we just released, the State of Youth Sector around evaluation and action kind of captures that. They wanted reassurance that evaluation wouldn't get in the way of their trying to build relationship with youth, which is really what they are passionate about. We had to make sure that we built in processes that will pay attention to the relationship building mandates that they felt was the most important part of their work. One other thing that came across from the study we just released was the idea that the youth sector, they're not really hostile to evaluation. I think about 92% of participants out of the 197 organizations that we sampled, they said they understand that evaluation is important to the work they do in the youth sector. Their concerns are mainly around trying to make sure that whatever processes that you're developing or that you're choosing is aligned with the work they do. So we made sure that that we paid attention to how they understood the work they do. One of the difficulties, sorry, Rebecca, the next slide, please. One of the things we tried to do was then to step away from the traditional understanding of what good standards in evaluation is. Usually, within traditional evaluation, rigor in evaluation is understood as processes that follow experimental design, and these experimental research designs often emphasize randomization. So we stepped away from that to try to understand how can you build in rigor using other ways instead of experimental research designs that might not be applicable to the sector that youth organizations are working in. And there's a quote there that kind of captures that really well as well.
Thank you, Uzo. I'd like to ask now how we'll switch, and I'll bring in Harjeet, and I'd like to ask Harjeet if she could first reflect on, given all of this, how does the YouthREX evaluation framework respond to these challenges from your perspective?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. So at YouthREX, it's very important for us to respond to some of these challenges that Uzo has invited us to think about by, first of all, looking at the the culture and the context of the organizations, the institutions that are providing services to the youth sector. And when we think about the culture and the context, part of that means asking ourselves, what does it actually mean? And at YouthREX, we invite folks to think about actually the values of the organization and how the values of the organization will actually shape the design of the program and the services that you're providing. So, for example, if you're an organization that really cares about social justice and equity, how does social justice and equity filter into sort of every facet of your service delivery, from intake to providing services? So we want to actually create practices that trace how those values are shaping everything that organizations are doing. So what do you care about? What is your mission statement? And we want to support organizations to think about more mixed method approaches that allow for flexibility to explore the culture and context of organizations, and also what are the principles involved and what do folks care about. Other ways that we support folks to think about some of these challenges is also to consider some of the following questions that you'll see up on your screen. Are the data collection methods relevant and culturally sensitive? And what I would also add to this, to build on Sarah's contribution from a few minutes ago, how are the service users also socially, politically, and economically situated in the world across gender, race, class, LGBTQ? So we want to pay attention to those differences when we're working with communities. We want to also consider a very wide range of methods that actually support and are in line with how communities identify themselves, their needs, what's important to them. And we want to think about also, the question that I often ponder is, if we don't consider the diversity that exists within communities, then what are we at risk of doing? And some of the risks that are involved are, for example, we end up homogenizing entire communities. And what I mean by that is that we end up looking at them all as sort of one way. And everybody in a particular community is the same. And we lose, the richness and the diversity that exists within communities. And we are at risk then of actually perpetuating some of the barriers and forms of discrimination if we cast sort of a universal brush over all members of a community. So these are some of the questions that YouthREX invites folks to think about. We think about them critically, and we hope that these questions then support practices that draw out that diversity, that rich diversity that exists within communities.
Thanks so much, Harjeet. I'd now like to invite Uzo to share her thoughts on the three lenses that we've developed in response to these challenges.
Thank you, Rebecca. So what we did was to look at all the different challenges that we've discussed and the questions that Harjeet went through, and then to sum them up into three guiding lenses that we thought are really important to guide any evaluation we're doing within the youth sector. Those three guiding lenses include a learning-focused lens, a youth-engaged lens, and a contextualized methods lens. The first lens, the learning-focused lens, the key question that lens asks is, how will the youth program use the insights and findings from the evaluation to improve their services and promote youth well-being? So as we go through an evaluation service plan with an organization and we work with them to develop questions that they're interested in, that's a key thing in our mind. The learning-focused lens means that we're looking at taking on evaluation questions that can really provide lessons that the program can use and improve their program. That evaluation is not just about proving what the program is doing, Yeah, that happens within the evaluation we do with them, but good evaluation is more than that. Good evaluation has to also provide knowledge and information that a program can pick up and improve their program so that they can do the work they do better.
Yes. So we also look at evaluation through a youth engaged lens. So this asks, does the program evaluation of your youth program actively and meaningfully engage youth participants? So by this we mean, are youth voices being heard in the planning stages, in the implementation stages, and when we're trying to look back and make sense of the what you collected through your evaluation. So it's not just that they're just present at the end or involved in the middle, but they're engaged throughout the process, and that their voices are heard and responded to. And the reason why this is really important to us is that the research really shows that youth engagement improves the overall quality of evaluation and benefits the wider community as a whole. So it does this by it gets greater buy-in to the evaluation, so that when an organization wants to use what they've collected through the process to make change, there's lots of people who are invested and involved and who understand the process and can buy into that to push it forward. The other thing is that by involving youth actively, their skills, their capacity grows, and the community as a whole has a greater sense of how evaluation works, how they can get involved, how it can be meaningful, and how it can really impact and make positive changes in their community. So it builds up everybody's active involvement in feeling like they can make a difference in their community through evaluation and taking evaluation further to create change.
Hi, folks. So the third lens asks us to consider a contextualized method. And what we mean by contextualized method is that a big question that we ask is, do the evaluation methods allow a youth program to tell rich and nuanced stories about their processes and outcomes, and specifically about the complexity of doing youth work? And so, as Uzo mentioned a few minutes ago, we discourage more traditional experiential models of evaluation, and instead encourage what we like to call more creative methods. And creative methods, I think, are really useful and important because they allow us to build relationships with each other as members who work in the youth sector in the organization, but specifically with the youth that are seeking our services. So more creative or methods-oriented approaches allow us to nurture and build relationships with the youth that consult us, that work with us, as opposed to causing damage or disrupting or potentially creating more harm. And so at YouthREX, when we talk about more creative methods, we're encouraging folks to think a little bit outside the box. So how could we potentially use the arts, for example, as a way to get feedback from communities, from young people? How about narratives, doing interviews, focus groups? So these are all ways to shape more of a creative and sort of a multidimensional evaluation approach. Also participatory approaches where young people can actually take some of the lead in terms of how their voice is heard, as Sarah was mentioning a few minutes ago.
Now we'd actually like to launch a poll and get your feedback on these three lenses. So our three lenses are using multiple methods, so not just surveys, but a mix of surveys and interviews and focus groups and arts-based methods, youth engaged and learning focused. So we want to know for you, from your perspective, what do you think is the most important lens that would support a grassroots youth program evaluation? Okay, youth engagement is winning. People, thanks everyone for writing in. Youth engaged is really high. Everyone thinks that all of the lenses are important. No one has put none of the above. 60% of people who voted have said youth engaged is the most important to you. 24% have said that using the multiple methods is important to you. And 16% have said that the learning focused is important to them. Thanks so much, everyone. So now we're going to move into our framework, and we're just going to discuss that a bit more at length, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to kick it off. Yeah. I'm asking, can you begin by providing an overview of YouthREX's 3-phase, 7-step framework?
Yes. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So here is the diagram of our framework, which is both really colorful, happy, and really helpful. It has 7 steps that are connected to each other and connected to the 3 phases that run through each step of the process. So the idea is that this framework lets youth organizations tailor the evaluation to their needs and interests and what they want at the end of their evaluation process. The steps move forward, but they're not in a line because we also want the framework to be one where organizations can go back and forth through the steps, and so that, you know, if you get to step 3, planning and focusing your evaluation, and at that moment either something sort of changes in your organization, or just being in that part of the framework, you realize that there were some things that you missed in stage 2 of understanding your program. We want organizations to be able to move back and forth through the framework so that they can continue to enhance it and really make sure that it meets their needs, and both in terms of what your organization is already doing, but also what you want outside of the process. So the idea is that this framework really helps with both planning and the implementation of the evaluation. And it reimagines the purpose and methods of evaluation by emphasizing the lenses that we just spoke about and ensuring that every step moving through the evaluation is taking into account those lenses, and those are through which all the planning and implementation and action happens. Next slide, please. So step 1 is the pre-evaluation checkup. So this is where we really want to work with organizations to find out where you are in the process. Is this the first time your organization is really thinking about evaluation and at a point where they can implement something? Or is this something that you're sort of further down the journey and have both ideas about your program and what you want at the end of it refined, and some tools already refined, and you need some different sort of supports from us? This is also the sort of point where we take some time to talk to you about what capacity you have to engage in evaluation. So what's your sort of time constraints? What sort of abilities and skills do your staff have? What sort of opportunities are there to build up staff's abilities and skills? And so those are the assets that you can bring. Also, you know, is your community really engaged already with your organization? Can we sort of really use them to help build the evaluation? Do you have experience in different creative practices that could really be built in and brought to the evaluation? Also, we want to ask, you know, what resources do you need to successfully complete your evaluation? So the idea here is that we don't want to create processes that are just one-off and you can't use again, but the idea to create a practice that is sustainable and can really become integrated into the life of your organization, and to enhance and build that as you go. And we want the process is really collaborative so that we can ensure that there's a really shared understanding about your assets and resources. And so, you know, we might create an inventory of the data that your organization already collects in order to sort of see how we're going to move forward in the process. The next step, oh, sorry, can I have the next? Great, thank you. The next step is, this always sounds a little bit scary to me when other people talk about it in terms of what is your program theory and intended outcomes. And I think that what we're looking at here, though, is actually a lot more everyday than that language kind of sounds. Once you start talking about logic models, I get nervous. But instead is really about how do you make sense of your program? Why do you do what you do? What do you want at the end of the day? How does it make sense to you? How does it have meaning? And so understanding that meaning and the context and your hopes and dreams for what you want as the outcome of what you do is what we mean by understanding what your program theory is, looking at your specific components of your program. So what is it that you do? What different pieces of work are staff doing, and why do they do those pieces of work? And what do you hope that you young people would get out of those pieces of work at the end of them? So a logic model, while it sounds kind of scary to me, is actually just a picture. It puts all those questions on a page so that you can look at them and see how one step connects there. Because I think for lots of us, we sort of bury our heads down and are trying to keep up with our work and sometimes lose sight of why we started that particular activity and where we want it to get to. So it's trying to look at what we want to accomplish, how we're accomplishing it, and who's trying to accomplish different pieces of that process, and putting it together so that we have a really shared understanding of what the program is about. Next slide.
Yeah, so once an organization has gone through the first and second steps, they have a good sense of why, what the resources they have that can support an evaluation, what they need. And at step 2, they know why they do what they do. I like the way Sarah describes the logic model. And then we get to the action phase. The action phase has 3 steps. We like calling the action phase the juicy part of evaluation, because this is really where you get down to the business of trying to develop a plan, collect your data, analyze that to tell the stories of your program. So the first step of that action phase in step 3. Rebecca, sorry, can you go to a slide before that? Yeah. So in step 3, this is where you bring all your stakeholders together, your program stakeholders, including youth, to try to figure out what you want from your evaluation. We encourage programs to develop an evaluation plan, because we feel an evaluation plan is like a roadmap. It's like you're going on a journey. If you have a map, even when you forget where you're going, you can go back to the map to figure out where you want to get to and how you thought you'd get there. So the evaluation plan will identify the questions a program thinks they want to answer, still keeping in mind those 3 lenses we talked about, that an evaluation needs to be learning focused. So within the evaluation plan, some of the questions that we encourage them to reflect on is: who will manage the evaluation and who will collect the data? What stakeholders do you need to be involved in your evaluation? How are you going to analyze your data when you collect it? What are some of the important steps within that you think your evaluation has to take? Once you have an evaluation plan, then you're ready to take off to the next step, which is step 4. Yeah. So within step 4, you will then collect the data you need to answer the questions that you outlined in your step 3. Usually within step 4, we encourage programs to do both a process and an outcome evaluation. I think sometimes people tend to get to outcomes too quickly without trying to understand how their program has been implemented. So you start off first with a process evaluation where you try to understand how you're implementing your program, what the satisfaction is, how you feel about your program, what the experience of your program users are like. And then, trying to figure out how you're going to collect those stories. And then again, keeping in mind the lenses that we've talked about, The third lens that emphasizes contextualized methods. We encourage programs to collect both, quantitative data and qualitative data. The qualitative can take different forms. It can be arts-based approaches, it can be interviews, it can be focus groups, and also involving youth. And then for the outcome evaluation, you go back to your logic model to make sure that all those things you've identified during step 2 that your program is trying to achieve, that you're collecting data during the outcome evaluation that answers those questions. Next slide, please. And then in step 5, which is the final step of the phase 2, you then, you have your data now that you've collected, involving your youth and your other stakeholders, and then you start trying to make sense of that data you've collected. If you've collected, you look for patterns, you look for themes that help you answer the questions that you set out to answer. Some of the, sometimes we kind of call this phase the show and tell. It's like show and tell for your program, right? People know you've collected data that can help people get a better understanding of the work you do with youth. So some of the questions that we encourage programs to ask at the analysis phase is, how do the meanings that you're coming up with from your data, how do they relate to the intended outcomes? What kind of lessons are emerging from your data have you learned? And how can those lessons go back to your program? What do you think, what are some of the contextual factors that relate to what you're seeing in your data? What are some of the hard to measure impacts of your program that maybe the data is not showing? Because sometimes programs do have a good sense of what the impacts of their program are. And then how can you then try to document those impacts that you feel are not showing up using the methods that you've selected? Okay, so the final phase, so you've gone through the first 2 steps in phase 1, you've gone through the 3 steps in phase 2, which is the action phase, and then you get to the final phase that we call the legacy phase. We feel that, if you think about, if evaluation really, the ultimate goal of evaluation is to help programs understand what the legacy of their program is. So within these 2, there are 2 steps within the legacy phase. Step 6 is really where a program focuses on what they've learned from their data internally. They look at what the findings are. They find ways to share that internally within their program with their stakeholders to figure out how they can use those findings to make the changes they need to make, and sometimes to just keep doing what they're already doing. So the first step 6 is really learning from the evidence internally. And then once you've done that, you're ready to share your findings externally. You go to step 7. The next slide, please. You go to step 7, where you learn from the evidence, but you're now ready to share your what you've learned with external stakeholders using different methods. Typically, traditional evaluation kind of relies on that big, fat evaluation reports, but there are so many other ways you can share your findings. Going beyond that, you can do infographics, you can do podcasts, you can do videos, you can do a presentation, just thinking about ways that your external stakeholders can engage with your findings to learn about the real story of your program beyond just a 20, 30, 40-page report. Yeah. The next step.
Okay, everyone, that is our evaluation framework, and I'd like to invite people now to type in questions to Sarah, Uzo, Harjeet. We have one question already, which I think Uzo could answer. This is a question for you, Uzo. Someone has asked, for government funding, are they moving away from surveys? Are they looking at implementing multiple approaches to evaluation from the funder side of things? Because this person has noticed in their work that surveys aren't always accepted by young people.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's one thing one way we've tried to expand our mandate within YouthREX is to find ways that we can push funders and other stakeholders to reimagine what is credible evidence, right? Typically, when people think of credible evidence, they tend to think of quantitative data that you collect through surveys. But if surveys don't really tell the whole story of a program, how can we at YouthREX also push the sector towards understanding that stories can be as credible as quantitative data? So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, for us, I think that's one of the ways we're going to judge whether we've accomplished our goals. So in addition to working with youth programs, we've also tried to have funder roundtables. If you look at the state of evaluation and action within the youth sector, the reports we released, I think we have 5 recommendations for funders, and one of those recommendations is to broaden what they understand as credible evidence. Yeah. So I think some funders are more willing to look at other kinds of evidence now, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make that happen.
Thanks, Uzo.
Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Thank you. The next question, okay, we're having a lot of questions coming in. This question, I wonder if Sarah could reflect on experiences with doing participatory research. And this person is asking how you would create a logic model through a participatory process. I'm thinking, what are some steps? I know you've just run noise. So what are some of the ways that that I know we have, through the Noise Project, helped young people to prepare them to participate in the different parts of an evaluation cycle? This person is asking specifically about logic modeling, but I think we can respond a bit more broadly.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the challenge is sitting down beforehand and trying to work out how to make it meaningful for the young people involved. So I think when young people, like we saw very much through our most recent noise program, when young people see that they have a voice that's going to be counted, and that being involved is going to have an impact for them and their community, then they get on board. So, I mean, I don't think you want to go in and speak about in the language of logic models. I think you want to really find ways to tell the story that is a story that has meaning to them. So you want to speak about and engage them on what is it that they hope being involved with the program will achieve for their community, and what sort of activities do they think could take them from their hopes and dreams for that program to the outcomes that they imagine. And so it's trying to, I think a logic model is a story, and so it's trying to get them engaged with a story that has meaning for them and the organization. And like I find that young people want to be involved with things when they see it as important to them and their world. And so that's the challenge when trying to do something like a logic model, is taking it out of this sort of higher thinking level and making the impacts and reason why this is valuable really clear, and then youth jump in my experience.
There are a lot of questions about youth engagement. Uzo, did you want to suggest something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly that, in addition to all that, and not to spring it on them, so to give them enough time to understand why you're doing an evaluation. So if you look at the noise program, we start talking about evaluation during orientation to the program. So, you tell them ahead of time as they're joining the program, you will do an evaluation, you explain what an evaluation is, you give them opportunity to participate in designing what the evaluation, what kind of questions you're going to be asking. So making sure that they are part of designing the process, because typically programs get to youth when they need the data, So when, now we have to complete this survey, then you bring youth together, you're like, complete this survey. Then it becomes really hard. So if it's participatory, they have to be involved right from the beginning.
One person has asked, I think, a real life challenge around managing multiple evaluations because many organizations have multiple programs. And so this person is sharing that they run 3 different programs with very different aims, goals, and even philosophies. So one program is, well, I don't have all of the details, but some are with quite different groups of young people facing very, very different challenges, which would require kind of a different kind of ethics. And they have very, very limited resources. So they're asking, how would you approach designing evaluations within this context?
You want me to?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So within that context, the first thing is, evaluation is not about creating all new data collecting processes. Build on what you're already collecting. So, if you think about it, most programs already have intake forms. They have intake forms. So the intake forms can be, built into your evaluation. If you're not collecting everything from the beginning, it reduces the burden of evaluation. And then thinking and keeping the processes a bit simpler, so that you're not doing too much. If you're trying to do 3 evaluations at the same time, perhaps you're not going for a pre-post, you're doing only post program only. So just keeping it simpler. I personally think that a little bit of evaluation is better than no evaluation at all, because sometimes, programs, they're so busy, they are dealing with so many multiple issues, and then so evaluation gets put to the back burner because it feels very overwhelming. So if you look at data you're already collecting and say, what does that tell us about our program? How can we build an evaluation around these processes we already have in place? And then we'll collect a little bit new data that specifically responds to questions that the data we have already might not be able to answer. It keeps it manageable.
I have another question that I think is very relevant. This person has asked, sometimes youth get frustrated when they feel they're constantly being evaluated or being the objects of evaluation, but they're not seeing the results that affect them directly. So the program is doing the evaluations for the program. The youth are the objects of the evaluation, but they don't see a direct result of their impact or their feedback. So does anyone have any suggestions about that?
That's why the model doesn't end with, once you have your, it ends with those 2 steps in the legacy phase. That's why, that communication is really important, because if you go to youth, you collect all that data, then they don't see anything. Next time you go back to them, you want them to fill out new survey. They can't see why that matters. So if you take the time to at least share something and say, here, this is what we learned, and this is what we're going to do with what we learned. One of the things we learned from noise that we still laugh about is when we did the focus group, the way they describe noise, it's like fun, food, and can't remember the 3 words, and love, right? So we keep on repeating those over and over again to them so they know it came from the evaluation. They can actually see that some of the things they told us, that we pick them up and then we'll take it seriously. So there has to be a way that you can show them that whatever information they are giving you, that it does matter, you're listening, and you're making changes based on, what you heard from them.
And I also just wanted to add, the poll showed that over 60%, want to look at more youth engaged evaluation practices. And I think that's a really important lens because it sort of flips the script a little bit. So it's less about we're evaluating you, but we want your feedback, right? So for me, I think that language and that shift is really important. And I'm also thinking about the feedback that is received. How can we take that feedback and create very concrete changes? And I think that's the hardest thing in organizations is how do we make this concrete? How do we show that this evidence, this feedback has been really important to us? So I used to work for many, many years in the anti-violence sector. And in intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And we used to send out surveys post, once clients finished with the service, and we realized that we were only getting like about a 2% return rate. Like nobody was actually filling them out. So we had to go through a whole process to create an environment that supported service users to offer us that feedback. But one concrete example was that our wait time was too long, that our waiting lists were too long. Folks were waiting for too long to get into the service. So how can we take that feedback and implement something that's very concrete? We realized we couldn't make the wait list move any faster. I mean, it's based on how many folks work in the organization, how many counselors are available, funding, all those constraints that most organizations are dealing with. But one concrete way that we responded to this was to say, okay, if you're on our wait list, what we can do to provide support is at least offer a few appointments right at the beginning. So folks aren't sort of left out there stranded for a while, because it could be actually weeks before they get in to see someone. But just making that one small change where folks could at least come in and see a counselor for a few appointments when things were very acute and difficult was a concrete way to respond to that feedback. So how can we as organizations take youth feedback and see if there's any wiggle room anywhere where we can shift things even a little bit so it feels like there's some responsiveness, and changing the language from evaluation to feedback, right? So youth don't feel like, okay, we're these objects, as Rebecca was saying, but we actually were contributing something to the organization.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's also taking the problem to youth. Like, I think it's saying to them, look, we have these funders, they want to know these kinds of things. What is it that you want to know about what's important to the program? Do you have questions? And to try to build those together and to integrate them, right? Like, I'm not sure some of the answers to those questions they're good questions to ask youth versus somebody like me to sort of say, okay, like, we want this to work for you. Do you have ideas? And I'm always impressed that youth come up with ideas that I never even thought of. And so they really expand the field of my thinking when I go and take those questions to them.
I think the last question that I'll leave with you guys, because we're out of time, is really about the political context of evaluation. Two people have asked, and it's clear that, our model is inviting and people are interested in it, but they're also in organizations that are thinking that funders need them to do, or funders do need them to do results-based accountability. So they're saying there's results-based accountability frameworks, and they're wondering how a results-based accountability framework, or if a results-based accountability framework could fit with our framework. And another person has asked, I think similarly, around concerns around credibility, reliability of your data. What's the value of internal evaluation versus external evaluation, having a third-party evaluator come in? So I think both of those are questions really about the politics of evidence and how, given that this is the reality within the sector, how do we work with that?
I can speak to the internal versus external evaluator, and then Sarah, if you want to pick up the other one, maybe? Okay. So if you have the funds to hire an external evaluator, that's not a bad idea, considering how much work people already have to do. Whether you're working with an internal or external evaluator, what we're trying to do is provide youth workers with a language so they can participate in asking questions about their program. So if you're doing it internally, you're asking those questions, but even if someone else is coming in, you know your program better. You know the values of your program. So you can say to the external evaluator, it's really important for us that our youth participate in asking these questions. We don't want to use only surveys. We don't think surveys can represent the complexity of the work we do with youth. We want to use multiple methods. We want to, have data sources from multiple sources. So you can, if you have the funds from an external evaluator, you can then work with them together collaboratively because evaluation is really about asking and answering questions about your program. And who knows the program better than the people that work within the program and the youth who are involved with the program? So I think that you can still work with, we're not saying don't work with an external evaluator, do it all yourself. But at the same time, we're not saying that, we're saying that credibility, you can get rigor using other ways. That rigor is not only using experimental design that might not be aligned with what a youth organization does. That if you use multiple methods and they all tell you the same thing, that's another form of rigor. If you collect data from different sources and they tell you the same thing, that's another form of rigor. So that's another form of credibility. So I think the field is also changing. The field, I think more and more people are starting to question how well, experimental design serves the kind of thing that we do within the social service sector, not just the youth sector. More people are raising those questions.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the reality, I'll just be quick. I know we're running out of time, but I think we all work in these realities, and we have to ensure that the evaluation does meet the needs of funders. But we're doing two things. First of all, as Uzo said, we're having conversations with funders, bringing them into YouthREX and trying to see if we can make some change there. But I think even at the organizational level, this is trying to have conversations and trying to see if there's a way of taking what the funder wants and broadening it, adding different layers to it so that it can achieve multiple outcomes for you. And so that's trying to do some redesign and some creative redesign with that in conversation with the people using your programs, your staff, and the funders, and keep those conversations enlivened.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Uzo. Thank you, Harjeet, for today. And thank you to all the participants who tuned in and who asked questions. We didn't get to all the questions by far, but we are going to have a recap blog where we will address the questions that were asked. And you can, always email us or connect in other ways.